You ready?
Yeah.
All right, Christy. All right. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Our folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have us back. Christy Pearl. Christy, welcome.
Thank you so much. So great to be back.
You are welcome. So Christy is a certified EMDR therapist and consultant in private practice in Massachusetts and Virginia, who specializes in providing EMDR intensives for adult children of alcoholics, dysfunctional families, or ACOAs, who are dealing with work stress and performance anxiety to create a healthy relationship with their work so they can be who they want to be today instead of who they had to be as children. Christy, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back.
So share with the listeners who maybe didn't listen or don't remember, but where are you from originally and where are you currently?
Yeah, so I am originally from Virginia, and that is where I am currently. Although I have spent most of my adult life was in Massachusetts. I graduated from college in Virginia and then moved to Boston for grad school and built a life and a career up in Massachusetts. And then about 2 years ago now, came back to Virginia to be closer to family here. And so I think of it like I have two homes. I can't leave Massachusetts out of my heart. So I just think about it like I have two homes now.
All right. So, as we were discussing before we started recording here, last time we talked a lot about your story, and I'm not surprised. I mean, that's what I love to do. And we're going to do that too. But today we're going to, as you said, evolve the conversation and talk really more specifically about how you work with ACOAs, as we'll call them, adult children of alcoholics.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do that, just give our listeners the thumbnail of how this did start for you,
Mm-hmm.
how this interest started for you.
Yeah. Well, I like to say that, like so many therapists, I became a therapist out of my own wounding. I'm very much a wounded healer. I like to think I am pretty far along in my own recovery now, which allows me to be present with others on their journeys. But I think that many times we therapists come into this field out of us, whether it's conscious or unconscious, search for our own healing and our own understanding and awareness. And we start out with all of those pretty reasons why we tell ourselves we're becoming therapists, because I want to help people and I'm just so empathic. And then when we dig a little deeper and do a little bit more of our own work, we kind of see some of those, I won't call them not pretty reasons, but they're maybe more real about why we are going into this field. And that is very true for me.
So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and that was definitely my experience too. But so more specifically, the working with adult children of alcoholics. I'm assuming that was your experience. You were or are.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am an adult child of an alcoholic. And so, I've done a lot of healing around that on my own. And, eventually, as I progressed through my career as a therapist, it eventually, as I really allowed my authentic self to become more visible, it allowed me to really allow those parts of myself to come more forward and be able to be a little bit open about my own lived experience. And not that I specifically speak to that or share that in sessions, but I think when I have opportunities like this with you, where I can share on a larger platform, I can be open about that. And I think that lived experience helps me help other people when you understand those issues. I mean, I think any therapist can be empathic about those issues, but it's a little bit different when you actually have that lived experience yourself.
So an adult children of an alcoholic. I mean, that can mean many things. Obviously, alcoholism affects people in many different ways, of course,
Mhm.
as we all know. It's very interesting as we're talking right now. My ex-wife is an adult child of an alcoholic
Mhm.
who never really dealt with it,
Mm,
you know,
mhm. Yeah.
and it's interesting how that has played out. But so so you work with, this is your specialization. You work with
Mhm.
these individuals. How do you work with them with the understanding that everyone's different? But
Mhm.
let's get specific here. What does it look like? Someone comes to you.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say is that when I first started sort of marketing, like, okay, I'm kind of hanging out my shingle no longer as a sort of general trauma therapist. I'm really speaking and calling out this ACOA. I thought, in my mind, any of my colleagues and friends who are trauma therapists could help ACOAs. And I still believe that. Of course, that is true. But what I got back from people seeking me out was, oh my God, I've never seen this before. I didn't know that there were therapists out there that specialized in this. And that was just really interesting to me because in my mind, like I said, any of my colleagues can help you. Trauma therapy is trauma therapy, if in a way, in a sense.
Mm-hmm,
But there was something about that acronym, ACOA, because if people identify as ACOA, that's really meaningful. And there was something about that spoke to them and meant something to them that apparently was rare. So that sort of surprised me. I wasn't expecting that when I first, kind of advertised myself as a therapist for ACOAs. So that kind of made me get curious about people's journeys. And what I have found is there are people who really identify with, I'm an ACOA, and there are probably people who have some level of exposure to an ACOA 12-step meeting maybe, or they've heard of the book. They've got some level of, they've seen that somewhere and that has resonated for them. And then there are people who are ACOAs and don't know it.
mm-hmm,
So depending on, that the stage of sort of awareness that someone is in, or the level of awareness that they have, that's sort of our starting point when someone comes to me. There are people who come to me who know that they're ACOAs and they want that kind of support specifically from someone like me who, has that area of specialty. And then there are people who don't necessarily know that they're an ACOA, or they might suspect maybe that has something to do with them and they're feeling curious about it. So for them, I probably back up a few steps and we
mm-hmm,
we do some education about what does that mean and what has that meant for you, and what pieces of this really resonate for you, because of course there are common characteristics or traits, but we don't necessarily, they don't fit 100% for everyone because we're individuals, we're unique. So it kind of
yeah,
depends, our starting point kind of depends on where are they at with their present level of awareness, understanding, and then acceptance.
mm-hmm,
Because there are people who may cognitively understand that they grew up with an alcoholic parent, but on an emotional, physical level, in their sort of emotional self, physical self, unconscious mind, there are protective parts around that. And
mm-hmm,
there's a need to say, well, okay, yeah, I had an alcoholic parent, but I'm good. Like that that has nothing to do with these problems I'm having.
Right, right. It's so
So,
very
you know,
interesting because
that's
as you're
protection.
talking, there's so many layers to this, right? I mean, and obviously it's very complex and shows up in different ways. Um, we all know alcoholics can have very vastly different behaviors and
Mhm.
impact the family differently.
Yeah,
It's very
that's
interesting
very
because
true. Yeah.
my ex-wife, her father was an alcoholic who was verbally and physically abusive to his wife, so her mother and her brother, but not physically abusive to her. But she lived, soaked in that hypervigilance,
Yeah.
which, as you're kind of describing,
Mhm.
to this day hasn't really dealt with it and doesn't really acknowledge it to a certain degree, certainly hasn't really gotten any help at all. But it's so interesting because a lot of people are like, well, that wasn't trauma. I wasn't traumatized. I wasn't in a war. I didn't get raped, you know.
Mhm.
Um, so if you can you take us to an example of maybe someone you've worked with? Obviously, we don't need names and all that stuff, but give us a more refined glimpse of how you might work with an example of an ACOA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, in my case, I also practice a little differently than maybe the traditional therapy model. So, I use EMDR. I'm an EMDR therapist. And, for anyone listening that might not be familiar with that, EMDR is one of many what we would refer to as more bottom up approaches that really is more based in a somatic or body based approach to trauma, because what we know is you don't just think your memories, you feel them. And trauma doesn't live so much in our thinking brains as it does in our emotional and physical brain, in our more, I'm using a word, implicit brain, more unconscious is one way of thinking about it. So the way I work is that we, let me contrast that with a top down approach, which people might be more familiar with. So
Mhm.
talk therapy is a top down approach. You are using your thinking brain, your cognitive understanding, your intellectual understanding to think about and maybe process through the things that happen to you. And that's good, and that can be very helpful. And most of the time, often at least, talk therapy is helpful but insufficient at addressing some of the the symptoms that would be part of recovery from being an ACOA. So a second ago, you mentioned hypervigilance. So this is a really classic example, actually, that, many people that I work with come into therapy with what I would call chronic hyperarousal. So when you
Mhm.
grow up in a home where you've got to be ready, you've got to be ready for whatever is coming down the pipeline on a day-to-day basis. Your nervous system has to adapt to that. And again, you're a child. You're just a child. This is not a decision that you make. It's something your body and mind, your nervous system does for you. And your nervous system is your best friend. And your nervous system loves you so much that it's always going to do what's best for you to keep you alive.
Mhm.
And so for a child in a home with a lot of chaos, instability, violence, fear, that child has to learn how to cope with that, because that child has got to get up and go to school and play with her friends and do her homework and her chores and all of the other things that any kid has to do. So, in order to adapt and cope with that situation, your nervous system might, one possible adaptation is to get really hyper vigilant and be really ready so that you can head it off at the pass. But what that does is it trains your nervous system to stay in that chronic hyper aroused state. And then your system learns it's not really okay to settle and be calm.
Mm,
So then fast forward a few decades, if we haven't done our work on that, then what that can look like in adulthood is the people who can't sit still, they can't relax, they are chronically exhausted because they're packing their schedules, they don't know how to just go on vacation and let it be. They or even if they are in a kind of calmer moment, they don't feel that way on the inside
mhm,
because their
mhm,
nervous system hasn't learned that it's safe to rest. So that's a really classic example and one of the, really common symptoms that I see. The other adaptation that I see a lot is the kind of the opposite. It's the chronic hypoarousal, which means now our system, same situation, maybe this person's nervous system adapted by getting really kind of numb. It went kind of it downshifted, like way
mhm,
downshifted into like, I'm just gonna kind of get by here. I'm gonna disappear. Like I'm not, like I'm checking out. I'm almost like dissociating. I'm not really even here. It's that almost playing dead kind of response that you might see in the animal kingdom. Because in these ways, we're really not that different from the
mhm,
animals. So that person in fast forwarding a few decades into adulthood might look like the person who's really struggling to advocate for themselves at
mm,
work in that sort of real, it might be that fawn response, that kind of really helpless, you know, depressed, kind of numb, checked out, really not able to really be present. Kind of that doormat, like
mhm,
they're sort of the office, like the one that's always picking up the slack for everybody because
mhm,
they don't feel like they have much choice. So there's a few different ways people can adapt, but again, any person's nervous system just does what it needs to do for them to help them cope with what's happening and give them the best chance at making it through. And so those are two of the most common responses I see, and at least the people that are drawn to my practice.
mhm.
Those are the two pretty common situations that I see.
And when people come to you, again, I realize it's many different reasons, but um, I'm imagining, there's you've got this interaction or relationship between the child who's an adult
Mm-hmm.
child
Mm-hmm.
with their parent who is or was an alcoholic, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
imagining there is shame there. There's a variance of quality of a relationship. Maybe there was a lot of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, are the people who are coming to you, do they recognize, or maybe are they wondering that this has gone on for them?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so when we talk about adult children, what we mean by that is that you have an adult who has grown up in a family of origin environment with emotional abandonment, chaos. And maybe this is another good thing to mention is, I work with adult children of alcoholics. That's a really specific kind of adult child. But really, an adult child is any adult who grew up in a home where there was emotional abandonment, chaos, emotional neglect, any kind of abuse. So addiction or alcoholism can be one of those types of situations that could result in, all of those things, but it's certainly not the only one. So, when we're talking about adult children, we could be talking about an adult child of, you know, overly worked parents, or we could be talking about adult children of narcissistic parents. We could be
Mm-hmm.
um, talking about adult children of mentally ill parents. Any situation that impairs the parent's ability to really be emotionally, physically present for that child and nurture them in the way that any child needs. So if we don't get that, then we grow up and we become adults. And when we talk about the adult child, what that means is we are the adult and we have a child part of us on the inside that never got its needs met and never got to grow up and develop the way it should have been able to.
Right.
So we are adults, but our decisions and our actions and our feelings and behaviors in our adult life are sort of driven by and grounded in that unresolved childhood experience. So the child is in us. We are the adult child. So that is sometimes kind of it can be a difficult concept for some people to suggest that there's parts of them that that we're going to be trying to form a relationship with on the inside, because
Mm-hmm.
many people tend to think the answer is on the outside.
Right. Right.
So it's really learning how to pay attention to inside. And most adult children have spent their entire lives, childhoods, being trained to pay way more attention to what's happening outside of them than what's happening inside of them.
Yeah. I mean, there's something um sad, really
Yeah.
sad about this whole idea of neglect, and emotional abandonment.
Yeah.
And oftentimes a lot of us don't realize that that's what happened, right? We just see the
Mm-hmm.
behavior
Yeah.
of an alcoholic,
Yeah.
but not realizing that what we experienced as a young kid is now coming out, is now the effects of that are revealing themselves. And I would imagine that oftentimes people are like, well, no, that's not really what happened, when in fact that's really what happened.
Yeah. Well, denial is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's amazing. And I really validate that. Whatever, sometimes we use the word defenses. I don't love that word. I tend to think in terms of protection.
Hmm.
So whatever protective parts are there or protective responses are there for a person, they're there for a really good reason. So if you are in denial, that denial is there for a really good reason. It has helped you tremendously. Imagine where you would have been without that denial. And so when people can feel safe enough in the here and now to begin to get curious about that, then we can start to move out of denial. And that happens at any given person's own pace. Um, I'm not in the business of tearing down people's protective parts.
Mm. So, Christy, I know we did talk about this previously, but I want to, it's coming up for me again. As you're talking, there's, um, obviously you have your own experience with this. What do you feel? How do you engage with people? Someone comes into your office, maybe they don't know what the heck is going on.
Mhm.
Yeah, I know something happened, but what do you feel allows you to reach in and work with these people, guide these people?
Mhm. Well, I think my own ability to help other people is directly proportional to my work that I do. For, I can't take, or, I don't take anybody anywhere, but I can't go with someone to a place where I don't know how to go. And at the same time that, it's important for me to have done my work so I can be present, I can be aware of where are my buttons.
Mm.
And I know where those are, and I can be aware of them. I can do my own self management to, soothe myself. And then I am better at helping someone else learn how to do that on their own time. Um, you know, and at the same time, it's not all up to me.
Mm.
I'm half of the relationship. I show up. My job is to show up, be present, tell the truth with kindness to the best of my ability, and to not attach to the outcome. The moment I get attached to someone else's outcome, I'm overstepping. So people get to stay as dysfunctional as they want to for as long as they can, until they don't, until they're feeling curious about something different. And then I'm available. But I have to, I think any therapist knows, hopefully, that we have to be willing to let people stay sick if they need to.
The words of a seasoned therapist, right? Now, my, was it always that way for you?
Oh, of course not. You should have seen me 20 years ago. Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's something that, comes with experience and years of doing the work, both professionally and personally.
I mean, and I'm guessing that's really challenging to be able to say that. We have to be willing to let people be sick, be ill.
Yeah, and this is where, I I might get a little bit on a soapbox here, but this is really where I think many therapists get into some trouble. If we haven't done our own work and we are in the helping professions, it's really easy to get codependent with your clients
Mhm.
and to be overly invested in the outcomes, to be overly concerned with them. And again, back to that pattern of that we learn in early childhood when we have, unmet emotional needs. We get really good at looking more to outside ourselves, to the other, being overly preoccupied with
Mm.
the other, thinking our answers are out there somewhere. Our reality becomes out there. And so those are the seeds of codependence. And
Mm.
if you're a therapist and you haven't done your own work, it's really easy to fall into that dynamic. And I've been there. Most of us have, but hopefully we don't make a pattern out of it. But I think there are many therapists who do.
You mentioned earlier that in your experience there seemed to be a kind of, I don't know what I want to use the word, maybe camaraderie between people who identify as ACOAs, or
Mhm.
an understanding there. Talk more about that.
Yeah, well, ACOA it's a 12-step community. In addition to being sort of an identifier, it is an actual 12-step community, just like AA, NA, OA, or. So there are places and spaces for people to gather together, to support and heal, with each other. And so sometimes people who identify as ACOA are familiar with that 12-step community. There's literature, there are books. So sometimes people might have accessed some of those resources that are
Hmm.
available. And so that, might have really strengthened for them that sense of identity as an ACOA. And then sometimes people haven't. Sometimes people just recognize that they've heard that somewhere. They might not have ever actually participated in a more organized way in the ACOA community, but they might have just known or been aware that, yes, that's me. We're lucky, we have a lot of information we can access, from the comfort of our own homes at this point. So that's a good thing. And that's what I'm hoping to do today with you, is to add to the information that's available.
So more to that, how are you working? Who are you working with?
Mm-hmm. So how I work is I do intensive work. One of the nice things about modalities like EMDR is we don't necessarily have to follow the traditional convention of week to week 45, 50, 60-minute sessions, you know week after week, forever and ever, amen. Like, we don't have to do that. There's actually no research that supports that is, like, the best way to go about things. It's a convention because that's what insurance companies pay for. So we've all fallen into this is what we do. But I don't do that anymore, because for two reasons. One, there's no research that really supports that. And two, with EMDR, I really need more time with a client on any given day for us to actually finish our work and get something done. So the 45, 50, even 60-minute session works really well for talk therapy, the top-down approaches like skill building, coping skills, verbally processing things, kind of describing what happened, exploring maybe emotionally what that was like for you. That you can get that done in 45 minutes to an hour. But for EMDR and modalities like that, by the time you say hello, and by the time hello, what have you been noticing, or what, like, figuring out, like, getting oriented for the day, and then the other end, containing and saying goodbye, that left me with like 20 minutes to actually do any work. And that was
Hmm.
really unsatisfying to me, and my clients, in my opinion, were not getting as much out of that as they could. So at this point in my career, I actually, and this might seem a little provocative, but I actually feel like it's doing a disservice to clients to unnecessarily drag out their healing. So at this point, I do longer sessions. I practice intensively because it gives us more time to actually see change, because that's what
Right.
I do. I do change therapy. I I don't really do support therapy for the most part. Of
Mm.
course, if I have a client who's going through something and we need to kind of integrate or verbally process something, that's fine. That there's a time and a place for everything. But by and large, I'm wanting to do change therapy, and that takes a little more time. So that's how I work. And who I work with is, mostly mid middle-aged adults. I do, I would say young adults in their 20s, kind of that identity exploration. I love my 20 somethings that are sort of getting their feet under them and moving into their adult lives. And then I work with middle-aged adults who are sort of reassessing. That tends
Hmm.
to be the two groups that come to me. And we do exactly what my bio says. I'm all about helping them be who they want to be now instead of who they had to be as children. So moving out of that chronic hyper aroused state so that you don't always have to be on. When it's time to rest, you can actually rest. When it's time to play, when it's time to have fun, when it's time to go on vacation, you can actually enjoy yourself. So that's how I work and who I work with.
And you also offer consultation.
Yes, I do. I
Okay.
do work with other EMDR therapists who are wanting to develop their skills, get certified in EMDR, or learn how to do intensive work like I do. I also offer private practice coaching for therapists, and I really, it's important to me to really convey that in my consultation or coaching, the therapist comes first with me because I believe in putting our own oxygen mask on first. So I really support the therapists that I work with in consultation in much the same way that I do my clinical clients, which is helping them pay attention to themselves and like life before business. Your work ideally supports and reflects who you are. So your business was working just as hard for you and giving you just as much as you're giving it.
Awesome. All right, Christie. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Yeah, they can just go to my website. That's the best place to go. You can see all of my availability there and get to know a little bit more about me.
And that's Christie Pearl, ChristiePearl.com. We'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Christie, awesome. Love having you on here. Love talking to you. So inspiring. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's just such a pleasure to be with you. I've really enjoyed it.
I appreciate that. Take care.
You too.